Dois, teste, experiência, conferência, teste, 2, 2, 3, teste, 2, 3, teste, conferência, boa tarde, 2, 3. Experiência, 2, 3, teste, conferência. Tá bom, João? Tá? Ok, pronto, está feito, até já.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the migration conference again, if you have any newcomers. And today's last event is the plenary on migration governance. We will start with what happens and what may not happen in Portugal, and then move on to global. I will leave the stage in a minute or two, but before that, we will make a little announcement. My good colleague here will show you a little video. Room will go a little bit darker.
This is Tony G. Mr. Sailor, don't drown with the ship. You can find a way out on the dark abyss. Be smart, work hard to be what you wanna be. And remember that wise people never grow on trees. Follow the lighthouse, move on, move on, move on. Shed light on, light on, light on, light on. Follow the lighthouse, move on, move on, move on. If you ever meet the dark abyss, I'm gonna hit you with this. Follow the lighthouse, move on, move on, move on. Shed light on, light on, light on, light on. Follow the lighthouse, move on, move on, move on. If you ever meet the dark abyss, I'm gonna hit you with this. Ho imparato la lezione, sapere un ascensore colpisce e non fa male, può portare fino al sole. Meno libri, più tv, a far la polvere in soffitta. Nemo segue il faro, apre il fuoco dalla garita. Un italiano confonde la gentilezza per gentismo, la genialità per genetismo, lo sciacallaggio per turismo. E noi giovani solo una volta, possiamo cambiare la rotta. Dobbiamo salvare la flotta da ondate di pregiudizi che portano alla deriva. Ma tutto torna a galla in questo mare della vita. Questa terra promessa giustifica ogni sforzo. Il faro della ragione dà luce al tuo percorso. Mr. Sailor, don't drown with the ship. You can find a way out on the dark abyss. Be smart, work hard to be what you wanna be. And remember that wise people never grow on trees. Follow the lighthouse, move on, move on, move on. Shed light on, light on, light on, light on. Follow the lighthouse, move on, move on, move on. If you ever meet the dark abyss, I'm gonna hit you with this. Benvenuti al sud, siamo in volo Marabù. Fai la gita al faro con Virginia Woolf, stai con la tribù, quali Robin Hood dalla gioventù. Sai che la tenacia è una virtù, scegli tu, scappi e rompi sti tabù. E trova un obiettivo oppure nuota nell'acquario. Chissà quello che vuole, c'ha già tutto il necessario per coltivare un sogno e raccogliere tutto un giorno. Un futuro raggiante, qualcosa di straordinario. Allora signor marinaio deve seguire il faro per non essere fregato e per non essere schiavo. Follow the lighthouse, lighthouse. If you ever meet the dark abyss, I'm gonna hit you with this. Mr. Sailor, don't drown with the ship. You can find a way out on the dark abyss. Be smart, work hard to be what you wanna be. And remember that wise people never grow on trees. Follow the lighthouse, move on, move on, move on. Shed light on, light on, light on, light on. Follow the lighthouse, move on, move on, move on. If you ever meet the dark abyss, I'm gonna hit you with this. Allora signor marinaio deve seguire il faro, 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 per non essere fregato e per non essere schiavo, 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 schiavo.
So, thank you very much for watching our little video. Obviously, some of you have guessed what it is about. It's the next migration conference, TMC 2019. It will be hosted by University of Bari. Of course, they have that fancy name in Italian I can't pronounce, but I have my good colleague, Professor Michele Pellicani. She will say a few words. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ibrahim. Everything started, at least I thought, as a joke. But knowing Ibrahim, it became serious. So, as you saw, we will have next year, in the same month, the pleasure to host the next migration conference. And we'll be honored of that, and I hope we'll be as professional as the colleagues in Lisbon have been. So you will be all invited, I hope it will be in numbers, to the University of Bari next year. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming for the second plenary session of our Migration Conference 2018. I'm very, very pleased and honored to chair this session, which on migration governance, and we have three keynote speakers. We start with Pedro Calado, the High Commissioner of Migration in Portugal. So we start with the Portuguese case, and then we move global. Following Pedro, we will have Michele Lighton, Chief of the Labour Migration Branch of the International Labour Organization. And she will give a presentation on the Global Compact and Future Governance of Labour Mobility. And finally, Philip Martin, which is Emeritus Professor of the University of California in the US, will give a presentation on global migration patterns, policies, and prospects. And in the end, we will have a debate. So I invite the Portuguese High Commissioner to give his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the kind invitation from Professor João Peixoto and also from our moderator, Lucinda Fonseca. It's always a great honor to share with you and to be involved in such inspiring events. Well, the invitation came with the purpose of letting you know more about the Portuguese approach to integration, and that's where I will be focusing this communication. So let's start with an image, the image has the aim to remind us of where we come from and to remind us that the place where we come from should at least make us reflect on what we are now and what we want to be in the future. This is from 1957, and I will buy a beer after the conference to the one who finds what image is this. Does anyone want to take the risk? Yeah, there at the end of the room. Yes? What's your guess? I have to pay a beer. I'm so. I will pay you a beer after. Yes, that's true. It's really the eruption of the volcano in the Azores, the Capelinhos volcano in 1957. The most important is that after this eruption, a series of earthquakes occurred in the next few months and years, and it ultimately led to the displacement of over 10,000 people, Portuguese people, from the Azores in 1957 and 1958. But the most interesting of this story is that these 10,000 people, they were to be protected internationally in the US, in the United States of America, in what would be known as the Azorean Refugee Act. So the Azorean Refugee Act was an act that was approved by a strong effort of John F. Kennedy. At that time, he was senator in Massachusetts, and he approved this Azorean Act in order to bring these 10,000 Azoreans from Portugal, of course, to the US, to the state of Massachusetts, which now explains why there is such a large community of Azorean Portuguese in Massachusetts, now over 100,000 people because of family reunification. But what is interesting is to look at the newspapers at that time. In 1958, for instance, the Boston Globe has a brilliant quote, a brilliant piece of information, and the title was, "What if they are communists?" That was a question mark at that time. Okay, it's interesting to bring these people from the Azores, they need protection, but at that time, what if they are communists? So, in our DNA, in our experience, in our tradition, being the others, I think it's quite important to understand the Portuguese context. That was so a decade after And when we look at this picture, again, a beer for the one who finds where are we in this picture. Okay, no one wants to take a guess. Some experts in the room, they know the answer, so they are just saving my money, which I appreciate. This is from the second largest city in the world with Portuguese. I can help you. The second city in the world who has more Portuguese, after Lisbon, of course. The second is Paris, and this is Paris in the 60s. Yeah, exactly. Champigny, Saint-Denis, Port-Clichy. So this is what was meant to be named as the Bidonville, where over 1 million Portuguese went in the 60s. This is actually from 1968, and 10 years after the volcano in the Azores. And here we had the Portuguese, who at that time went to France illegally. Probably we would call them illegal immigrants if we were now looking at these individuals. They were facing, of course, a very strict regime in Portugal, but also they were running away of starvation and poverty. And probably they would be the ones now in the shores of Europe, or probably in Ceuta or Melilla, finding walls and fences, and these were the Portuguese in the 60s. Now it's, of course, a success story, a very good success story, and Portuguese in France are recognized as quite well integrated. But in the 70s, and this is from 1976, if I don't get it wrong, we had probably over 500,000 people coming from the ex-colonies, from the former Portuguese colonies, mostly in Africa. And we named themselves as returnees, but you can see, for the ones who speak Portuguese, they call themselves refugees. And this was probably around 500,000 people coming in 5-year time. It had an enormous impact in our society, but later research from the 80s also shown the positive impact they had, for instance, in innovation or even in the economy. So this is just to give you a short, brief overview of 3 moments of time in 3 different decades where we, the Portuguese, were the others, and where we, the Portuguese, were faced with the prejudice, with all the stereotypes that it normally pop up when we speak about migrants and refugees. But mostly, I think it's about to inform you of what I think is one of the main ingredients of the anti-populist formula. And I think that one of the main ingredients to fight populism is memory, is really not to let these images disappear from our memories, from our children's memories, and for the generations to come. The second thing I think it's important for that ingredient to tackle populism is facts. Not fears or myths when it comes to migration. Narratives are mostly built around perceptions, about fake news, about what is now very easily disseminated through several media, but it's really going back to facts. And probably this is one of the most important piece of knowledge that every year we release on the High Commission for Migration. It's the annual report on indicators of integration of migrants in Portugal. And this is from last year, 2018, we launched the 2017 report. And here we look at several outcomes of the integration of migrants. And then we try to build not only policy, but also narratives around these facts. We look at 25 different sources, administrative and statistical. And it's a work produced by the Migration Observatory. They are here, the coordinator, Catherine, and the staff. And it's probably one of the most important pieces of work we do every year, because from here we get the facts. The facts are, for instance, that in Portugal, we are now, again, on a positive net migration. This is from last week on the new annual report of CEF, the Foreign Police, where finally we came out again of a negative net migration that was occurring since 2011 in the country. Now we are again growing. Now I just got the data, that's why I was a little delayed. I was on the CEF on the presentation of the new annual report. We grew 6% in our stock of foreigners in 2017, and we are now in the aftermath of the crisis. But until 2018, 16, we were again on negative net migration. And you can see it here, the dark line, declining since 2010. Now, again, we are on a positive growth in terms of net migration. But the country overall is in a very fragile demographic situation, because in terms of natural growth, we are still having more deaths than births. So the complexity of this means that we can lose hundreds of thousands of residents in the next years to come if we don't act in an effective way. And, but new immigration flows are emerging to Portugal. The first one, and it's global, I know, but in Portugal has a strong impact, are international students. It increased 109% since 2008, and every year we are getting more and more international students. Sdgs is for sure one example of this. Another example and the new flow are elder people, retired people, mostly from European countries. Madonna, it's a great example, as you might know that she's now living in Lisbon, and many Europeans, but not only, are coming to Portugal for their last years, and they choose Portugal. But also highly qualified and researchers and highly qualified professionals are increasing to the country. So these are typically the three new trends in new flows to Portugal. In terms of nationalities, and here we gender disaggregate the data, of course Brazil is still the largest community. They represent roughly 20% of our foreigners. And you can see here clear feminization of these flows from Brazil. Almost 2/3 are women. Then we have, let me see, yeah. Yeah, okay. It's okay, I understand. Here it's disaggregated by gender. So Angola is the second community with more women. It's not the second largest community because it's actually Ukraine, Cape Verde, and then Ukraine the third. So, but here is gender disaggregated, so I was not getting the exact data. Here we get to look at the age structure for native-born population in yellow, and in blue you can see the age structure for foreigners. And you can see the absolute impact that foreigners have in a very aged age pyramid, the Ace of Spades structure, which is now reflecting the Portuguese composition. But you can see that in the ages, well, not only of working, but also on having children, the migrants are really contributing. And you can get this data. We have 3.8% of foreigners in Portugal, but they reflected 10% of the births last year. And in cities like Lisbon, it can get to 20% of the births. So you can understand the positive outcome, impact, that migration has on a very aged country and in a country where demography is really a challenge these days. When it comes to labor market integration, migrants in Portugal, and I know this is an exception for Europe, only Spain, Portugal are getting this exception, but migrants are more integrated into the labor market than the Portuguese themselves. Of course, because we have many elder people, they don't work no longer, but of course because also many of our aged working population has emigrated from the country. So we have more migrants integrated into the labor market than the Portuguese. And migrants, normally, they come and take the 3D jobs, the dirty, the difficult, and the dangerous jobs. You can see disaggregated by gender again. Women, for instance, almost 30% work as cleaning ladies, whether it's at home or in hotels or restaurants. And the men, mostly 15%. It's not so concentrated as for women, but 14% work as civil construction, and 6% as salesmen, and 6% as non-qualified workers in industry. One important aspect, and this is some of the myths we hear on the streets, on social media, is that, okay, but migrants come and steal your jobs, they take away your jobs. When we look at the data from the annual report, we can understand clearly that that is not true. The propension to create jobs in Portugal is 6 times more for a foreigner than for the Portuguese. And we know that the foreigners are also creating jobs for the Portuguese. So when you look at the data from the census, you can see this clearly. Migrants are creating more jobs, they are creating their own jobs, they are creating jobs for Portuguese, and the Portuguese, of course, due to the crisis, are creating less, and they created less in the last decade. So this is the type of facts and the type of punchlines that we really need to put into public opinion if we want to tackle the strong punchlines that create fear and myths. The propension to create a business in Portugal is 6 times more for a foreigner than for a Portuguese citizen. But, okay, but sometimes you hear, okay, but at the end of the year, migrants come and consume our social security, they take the benefits they can, they don't contribute. That is, again, false. We have been looking, with the support of João Peixoto and his staff, for the social security, on one hand, what people contribute to the system, but also what they take, because they have rights, and then we look at the imbalance. And since 2002, when we have been monitoring this data, there is no year where the contribution was negative. They always contribute positively. And the last time we looked at the data, which is from last year, it was over 400 million euros a year that migrants leave in our social security. Okay? And if we lose the focus on this, on facts, not myths or fears, I think then we will lose the race with populists and we will probably not be able to pass our message. So this is mostly part of our mission as High Commission for Migration. We have the umbrella organization in Portugal, depending on the Prime Minister. So it's integration in Portugal is seen as something interministerial. It touches all the areas of integration. And that means that we mobilize all the ministries to work together with us under our coordination. So we have this mission since 1996, where the Institute was created, to cooperate in the definition, implementation and evaluation of the public policies in matters of migration, but also to foster the integration of migrants and ethnic groups, and ultimately to manage the diversity amongst cultures, ethnic minorities and religions. So this is our mission and the way we have been working for the last over 20 years. All this is embedded into a strategic plan. So there is this strategic plan for migration, which has been approved, the last version from 2015 to 2020, and that also gives you an idea on how migration is perceived in Portugal. It's perceived as a long-term strategy, and I think that's something that in some countries we are facing more and more challenging. So we have 6 years to implement a plan, and the plan mobilizes all the ministries in Portugal. So here you have a set of 106 practical measures that all ministries implement with our technical supervision to guarantee a better integration of migrants in Portugal. We try to cover what we call the migration cycle. So this means we are trying more and more to reach for attraction measures, new visas, ways of attracting specific labor demands that the country has. So it's really is now again being boosted with this idea for the new decade. There is a clear intention. The Prime Minister just came to public to say this, that the country will place globally as a country that wants to have more migrants. Then admission and permanence, that's normally the Foreigners Police, the SAF work to guarantee that people stay regularly in our country. The work with integration, which, as I mentioned, it's quite transversal, coordinated by the High Commission, but it touches housing, education, health, etc. Retention, for the ones that we think that staying in Portugal is still an opportunity. We have some solutions in order to safeguard that. The return, if the ones want to return, we have protocols with IOM for voluntary return, for instance. And now we are trying to develop pre-departure. We are trying to, and again, the Prime Minister just recently spoke about this. The country wants to be in the countries of origin, delivering pre-departure measures to safeguard that migration, if it happens, is done in at least a clear and informed way. So I'm finishing. Multi-level governance is the way we see integration, because in countries like Portugal, where we don't have regions, we only have federal, state, and the municipalities. If we don't work with the municipalities, that would be a loss of energy and, of course, of efficiency. So since 2014, we have developed a new generation of what we call local integration plans, We have invited the municipalities that have important amounts of migrants to come and work with the High Commission in developing these local integration plans. We have now 38 municipalities. Lisbon, that is the most important, was one of the first stakeholders to be involved, and we are now working in the majority of the municipalities that have migrants. The local index for intercultural openness, it's not a ranking, it's just a self-assessment tool to help the municipalities to understand the strengths and the weaknesses that they have in order to be more open to diversity and to migrants. Now, we have 98 municipalities that are along this local index. We are now funding local mediators to the municipalities. We just opened a call for 3.5 million euros in order to make municipalities involve mediators into their work. And then we have several projects, Next Door Family, Choices Program. I could speak for hours, but I just wanted to give you this idea of multi-level governance and the idea of the federal state, the central administration, working closely in partnership with the local scale. Portugal has been benchmarked globally with a one-stop shop model. I don't know if you are aware of the one-stop shop model. The idea was, in 2004, to bring under the same roof, the same building, all the public services that were spread throughout the city and to make them work together to serve the migrants. So we have 3 national centers in Lisbon, Porto and Faro. Here we have all, well, not all, but the majority of the public administration working on the same roof towards the migrants. For instance, there we speak 14 different languages. We have mediators working there. And now it's a very, I would say, replicated model in many countries. Last week in Canada, for instance, a new one-stop shop just opened, inspired in the Portuguese model. And then we have a network of 93 local integration centers in partnership with municipalities that work with the national centers. Awareness, of course, it's part of the policies in Portugal, not only through the Migration Observatory that I already spoke, but also through embedding contents and into, for instance, the national television, radio. We try to have more and more contents on this issue. Also by recognizing the best journalists and pieces of communication through what we have, which is a media award, a network of intercultural enterprises, now with over 200 enterprises compromised with not only the selection of staff, but also the training and the valuing of diversity. Now a network also for schools, we call it the network of intercultural schools. So here really what we are trying is to pave a society that is intercultural, that allows diversity to be normal, to be the normality in the years to come. So this is the type of work we are doing through our intercultural unit. After all, I think we have in Portugal what we can say, looking mostly when we compare, we can say we have an open society to migrants. We have problems. It's an unfinished job. But for instance, European Social Survey last year just highlighted that Portugal was, from the respondents, the country more open to supporting refugees. And I think that creates also a sense of the country we have and where we want to position ourselves. And that's how we became the 6th more compromised country in Europe in the relocation scheme of refugees from Syria, Iraq and Eritrea in the last 2 years. The program finished in March. We were the 6th more compromised country in Europe. And we could easily say this has nothing to do with us. We are not a country of arrival like Greece or Italy. We were not on the routes of the people crossing Europe. But our way to be in Europe is in solidarity. And we want to be in solidarity at moments of crisis. And I think this was our way to put this message into our European counterparts. So people are in 98 municipalities. Of course, we have challenges with the retention of these people because there is always this idea of the El Dorado in Germany or in countries like Sweden, but we have been doing our part of this challenge. And for instance, it's important, 49% of the people who came in the last 2 years, they are already working in Portugal or studying in university. And in a country that needs babies, having 29 births in the last 2 years, it's a blessing for us, of course. So to finish, what do we mean with integration? This is a kind of contaminated word, mostly in the last years. In Portugal, we perceive integration in this very simple model as a positive response to two questions. The first question is, should migrants maintain their cultures of origin? We say yes, migrants can maintain their cultures of origin as long as it doesn't collide with our fundamental rights, with our constitution. But yes, they have the right to maintain their culture of belonging. But we also believe that we should say yes when the question is, should migrants adopt the cultural identity of the majority of the new country of arrival? And here we also think that accommodation of cultures or just leaving people in their own spaces and times, it's not the best solution. So the idea is really to safeguard these two principles. What people bring, but the country of origin and the country of destination. So we have been trying in practice to deliver this as public policies. It's an unfinished job, but I think at the end of the day, we can say it has been a success story. Why? Well, 5 reasons. The migration story of the country, connecting to the beginning. We are the others, we know that. For each migrant in Portugal, we have 10 emigrants with an E living outside. This is always on our mind, okay? The strong political consensus. There is no party on parliament waving against immigration or refugees. It's an absolute consensus. The third reason, there is a clear leadership of the integration agenda. It's something interministerial, but there is an agency, which is my agency, the High Commission, that is really, showing the way, leading and mobilizing everybody. Public opinion. We have a very safe haven in terms of public opinion. In 2011, in the peak of the crisis in Portugal, the Eurobarometer showed that only 3% of the Portuguese considered migration as a problem. And that was the major concern for the rest of Europe. And here we only had 3% saying this. And finally, it's a joint work. It's multi-level, it's whole of society, it's whole of government, of course, but I think more and more it's whole of society. It's immigrant associations, it's volunteers, it's the citizens themselves trying to do their small part of the business. Because I think, and that's to conclude, that if we had done in the last 2 years, each country, each citizen, its small part of the deal, we wouldn't have had a migration crisis or a refugee crisis. What we had really was a solidarity crisis, probably an asylum system crisis, because it was too much people to be processed and to be analyzed. But if everybody did its part, including countries, we would never probably had what we can say a refugee crisis. And to conclude, going back to 1957 in the Azores and then the Azorean Refugee Act in 58, the truth is that in 2008, the Senate in the US approved Resolution 1401, recognizing the absolute valueless contribution of the Portuguese Azoreans in the US, and this was celebrated by this resolution when the 50th anniversary of the Azorean Refugee Act was done. So I think probably 50 years ahead, somebody in this room, probably not us, will be probably celebrating the contribution of the people who came, as long as we know how to integrate them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I invite the second keynote speaker, Michele Lighton.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, I think these are. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank Ibrahim Sirkechi for inviting me, and Phil Martin also for endorsing that invitation, along with Maria Fonseca and the university, to this very esteemed event. I'd also like to thank, I guess we have a, is it? Okay. I'd also like to thank our last speaker, the High Commissioner, for such a positive approach and explaining that approach from the beginning into the present day. I wish we could have more of that positive inspiration in so many other parts of the world, but I think we face many challenges. I was asked here today to give more of an overview of the international governance of migration. I'm from the ILO, so it's labor migration, which is really my focus, and to talk about this new governance regime, which will come into being very soon, in fact, the end of this fall. Member states at the United Nations are negotiating the first ever global compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration, and also a new compact, global compact on refugees. And they intend to adopt these this fall with new commitments, action items, and international coordination. Is that all right? Can people hear me in the back? Yeah. No? Yes? I should speak louder, yeah? Okay. Okay, thanks. All right, I'll do that then. So what I'd like to do is first ask a question that many are asking, and that is whether or not we foresee that these new international instruments, if you will, are going to help us create a paradigm shift in what we see in the news and read online and hear around the world in terms of the discrimination and xenophobia against migrants, against refugees, the viewing refugees and migrants as the other, the protection of labor rights and other rights of migrant workers and refugees when they're in the workplace. Are we really going to see a difference, and are these documents really going to become central in terms of our new approaches? And I have to say, of course, we have these being adopted in the context of what are becoming very toxic debates. Maybe not here in Portugal, and it's very good to see the consensus, but certainly in other parts of Europe, this issue has been driving elections. We can also see this in the United States and elsewhere. So it's a very important issue. And I can say that as a diplomat, the answer really is maybe. We don't know. And that will depend on a number of factors. I'd like us to consider, as I move through my presentation, 3 issues. The problems that we face as states, and the reason we called for these compacts, how this links to the existing governance framework, including the Agenda 2030 on sustainable development and the sustainable development goals, and the international labor standards and other human rights, and the scope of the compacts and what they intend to cover. So I want to discuss these in the context of labor migration, and let me begin with just some numbers. ILO has done estimates. There are 258 million as of now international migrants, but the last time we did our estimates, we showed 150 million are migrant workers, and that represented about 73% of all working age migrants who can possibly enter the labor force. So a significant fraction of people are moving abroad for jobs. We know that. We also know that if we look at the mobility across the world from other reasons, this mobility has increased in volumes in certain corridors. Now we know that migration as a fraction of population growth has not changed so much in quite a number of years, 3 to 4%. But it's the migration corridors and the stress that's put on certain countries and in certain regions which has changed dramatically. From Asia, migration to the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC, has tripled really in the last 15 years. That's different. Africa, migration to the Gulf Cooperation Council is now moving at a very fast pace. We also see enormous numbers of people moving inside their regions. This is not just about moving from Africa to Europe. This is about moving internally, whether it's in Asia, Latin America, in Africa, or in Europe. Most people move inside their regions and across contiguous or local borders. But we have seen that this has put a strain, together with the refugee crisis, on the capacity of governments to really govern. We have 60 million people who are displaced now. 20 million of them are refugees, and many of them who have not had sufficient protection. You combine that with a fragmented governance system in migration, which is fragmented globally. There is very little consistency in how any one country addresses migration, even within regions. And you find a fragmented framework to try and protect migrant workers and refugees. Now we look at that also in the context at the ILO at inequality and poverty and how this is tracking. So we find that there are correlations between poverty, lack of social protection, and migration, and that is those countries with higher incidence of poverty, lower levels of social protection, have higher immigration rates. And we can see this playing out in putting the Gini with together with migration corridors, so you can see per capita income against migration corridors, and it definitely shows the push from low income to higher income countries. This seems obvious, but when you look at some of those corridors, as I mentioned, from South Asia to the GCC, they are new ones. They are ones that have burgeoned and, as I said, tripled in some cases to those countries, and that is creating a real strain on the management systems in place. Some of the other issues that this mobility is creating now in recent times, and that is labor brokers play a strong role in matching workers to jobs, but they are doing this within and across countries, regions, globally, and it's become a multi-billion-dollar business, a business that takes great funds out of the pockets of migrant workers, puts them in debt, puts their families in debt, and creates debt burdens and high risks of trafficking, human trafficking, and forced labor. And this now has become a global concern to many, many countries. One country cannot regulate this on their own because these brokers operate online or through nefarious networks. But you will see from the surveys that we have done, and Phil has been involved with these, but the surveys we've done with the World Bank show that it is really a question of where you come from, of how much recruitment fees you pay. So even those going to the same country in the same sector are paying very high rates. Pakistanis are paying far more than Ethiopians, and almost up to a year's salary for their job. Bangladeshis and Sri Lankans who are going to Kuwait are paying also quite varying amounts, 10 times the rate for Bangladeshis. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons, but a lot of it cannot be explained simply because there is some kind of regulation that provides consistency, and it's the workers themselves. This is really a multi-billion-dollar unregulated business that's going on all over the world. So there's quite a lot of concern with that emerging issue. The other issue is the inequality gap. There's inequality widening around the world, but some of that is playing out, of course, for migrant workers within the workplace. Wages and working conditions are much worse for migrant workers by and large around the world, but I'm really talking about low-skilled workers. High-skilled workers, however, also appear in our wage gaps. Somewhere between 18 and 35% is the wage gap for a migrant worker and national doing the same job, which means that an employer or business is paying, in some cases, 35% less for a migrant worker doing the same job as a national, and that distorts labor markets. That also creates incentives for unfair competition among business, but it also leads to exploitation because migrant workers have far less protection of their labor rights, and this is not being regulated sufficiently. We have skills mismatch. Many workers in Europe, we found, are mismatched to their job, national workers, but it's even higher for migrant workers. You can see that our recent studies show 7 to 10% of natives may be overqualified in doing jobs below their skills level, but it's 11 to 18% for immigrants. And in some countries, this is extremely high and problematic, given that we're not utilizing migrant skills and talents. They may be stuck in lower income jobs and not be able to get out of it even when they return home. Now, I put this slide here for the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, because we have a new governance system in place on development. And the development framework is a very powerful framework because it moves money from development assistance toward areas. And we have new areas this time after finishing the Millennium Development Goals. The new 2030 Agenda calls for the protection of all workers and the labor rights of all workers, including migrant workers and women particularly, and those in precarious employment. We have, and that is part of the productive and inclusive growth and decent work objective of Goal 8. The targets, as I said, protect labor rights. How are we going to measure whether labor rights are protected? We have a number of ways, but there are two indicators now in the making. One is the frequency of fatal and non-fatal accidents, which often affect migrant workers very significantly, particularly on construction sites. That was what has emerged, especially from the World Cup discussions that were going on in Qatar and other places. But even countries that monitor these rates or have, they think, very balanced protection for migrant workers also find higher incidence of injury for workers, migrant workers. Then you have an indicator on national compliance with labor rights, and that is freedom of association, our fundamental principles and rights at work, which include freedom of association and collective bargaining among them. And we're monitoring those. And then the ratification of international labor standards is also a proposed agenda. Another goal is to reduce inequality of the 2030 agenda, and under this is Target 10.7, which is to promote, facilitate orderly, safe, responsible migration and mobility among persons through the implementation of well-managed migration policy. Now, measuring that is quite difficult, but one indicator that was adopted that we are promoting with the World Bank and that we are the custodians of for the UN system, ILO and the World Bank, is the measuring the recruitment costs paid by workers, migrant workers, as a fraction of their annual income. How much of their annual income is going to labor brokers instead of actually their pockets? International standards call for the elimination of all worker-paid recruitment fees and costs, but that's not happening in so many parts of the world. So we are coming up with a methodology, and we'll be testing that out with national statistical offices very soon. But we hope that alights more momentum around measuring and examining what migrant workers are paying. The other frameworks, of course, are human rights standards and international labor standards. And here I just want to mention a few of our international labor standards and a couple of concepts. One is that all labor standards, and that means the hundreds of conventions that ILO has adopted embedding those standards, apply to migrant workers unless they're specifically accepted. Labor rights should apply in the workplace whether or not your status is documented, undocumented, part-time, full-time, whether or not you're working as a woman, as a man, a different identity. Labor rights and labor protections are there for public policy purposes and to protect all workers, regardless of whether they're migrants or foreign-born. You cannot have a worker in a workplace with safety protection who's a national and right next to them operating dangerous equipment, a migrant worker who has no protection. That doesn't make sense. And for public health reasons, health and social protection need to apply. So the standards that ILO has really used as a benchmark equality of treatment and labor standards applicability in the workplace. We also have migrant workers' conventions. Migration for Employment Convention, which goes back to 1949, and our 1975 Supplementary Convention on Migrant Workers. And these have recommendations on how you treat migrants, refugees. Refugees are also included because of World War I and World War II, and ILO's work to move refugees into work, and deal with irregular migration. We have Domestic Workers Convention, and we have other standards on social protection, skills building, and a myriad of labor inspection, and so on. We have frameworks that help member states implement their obligations under these international labor standards. One is the Multilateral Framework on Labor Migration and other tools and guidance. This is all come wrapped into what our constituents, and we have 187 member states and tripartite constituents around the world. They have decided we need a fair migration agenda, we need a new paradigm shift in the way we look at these issues and practice these issues. And that involves making migration a choice, first and foremost, and not a necessity. So creating decent work at home and ensuring that migrants are able to move if they want to move, but not because they're treated badly, they can't find jobs, or there's conflicts and so on. We have also a new recommendation, 205, on peace and resilience for that purpose. ensuring fair recruitment processes, as I mentioned, human rights and labor rights implementation, equality of treatment, bilateral agreements, and agreements that really ensure protection for migrant workers, but also that involve, that they're based on statistics and data and evidence-based policymaking. One of the key areas that doesn't happen, which should happen, and which we promote under this agenda, is that the right players have to be at the table to negotiate the policies. I like that the High Commissioner talked about the intergovernmental whole-of-society approach. That actually is terrific, and that's what we are calling for, but it doesn't play out and happen in so many places. Employers, workers' organizations, ministries of labor are usually not involved in migration policy, even when it's about labor migration and work. But they need to be. They need to work with foreign affairs and ministries of interior that deal with the migration issue, so it's not just about security, it's really about the employment and the workplace. And the expertise resides with the ministries of labor and with the constituents and stakeholders who work in that area. And the agenda includes having a unified UN response. So often I'm asked, why do standards matter? Why are standards so important? I know you've had now 2 full days, and I've seen some of that is discussion on law, but they do matter because they put in place the framework or the baseline, if you will, for all the other actions that governments take. They put into place benchmarks that can be monitored, progress that can be examined, how data and how we should be measuring the treatment of migrant workers. Workers are in sectors that are often not regulated. Domestic work in many countries are not covered by labor law, labor rights. They're invisible workers, many of them women. If they're migrant workers, they have their passports taken and they cannot complain. They're afraid to be deported. Migrants who dominate a sector like agriculture or construction. In the US, a lot in construction and agriculture, and I know in Europe as well. We heard 40% of workers, migrant workers, migrant workers, are in construction. When sectors are dominated by migrant workers, there is often not as much empowerment to realize their freedom of association and trade union rights or to complain of abuses. They don't want to be deported. They don't want to risk their visa being taken away. They don't want to risk not being paid. So migrant workers dominating sectors means those sectors may actually begin to have wages and working conditions become lower and lower as new migrants come in, even less protected. And that's going to affect national workers as well. So we're very concerned about that. And one of the ways to help balance that is to have our policies reflected by employers and workers' organizations working together with the government. Now, ILO puts these into practice in capacity building with our tools and guidance around the world. We work in every region now. We have regional specialists, projects, and programs, and we're taking up new work with our constituents to help train them on all of the new governance and guidance tools that are available to them. But let me now get to how this fits within the new governance framework that's called for through a New York Declaration adopted in 2016. That called for the adoption of 2 global compacts on migration and refugees, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. We are supposed to be adopting commitments, action areas for joined up work, and better international cooperation and coordination, notwithstanding the public debates that we see going on. And I'd like to start with the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. I'm involved in those negotiations, but this is a state-led process, and member states are negotiating them. There are now in the document draft, which will be adopted next month, 22 objectives. And these objectives cover a whole range of areas of work. And in fact, when I was flipping through your brochure and looking at some of the workshops you've had, many of the issues you're dealing with are covered in some way by the Global Compact text as it's being negotiated. These 22 objectives cover the issues of how migrants are driven to migrate and how we should be adopting decent work to prevent that as a requirement instead of and a necessity instead of as voluntary. It moves to including data and statistics of all kinds. It looks at pathways for regular migration. It looks at the identity and migration and creation of decent work. It looks at the identity of migrants, the detention of migrants, along with issues like fair recruitment that I've mentioned, skills development and social protection. It also looks at how return and reintegration should be managed. And these are areas in which each of the objectives tries to tackle. What are the good practices that member states should be incorporating into their policies and practices as they move forward? The portability of Social Security is a new area. It's actually an old area that many countries are dealing with, but it's a newer area for ILO to provide guidance for migrant workers because it's been particularly difficult for countries to negotiate this across borders, especially between emerging economies and developed countries that are thousands and thousands of miles apart. We're also looking at this in regional context, and we have new tools that we're using to put into operation in order to allow migrants to take home their money and have retirement. The Global Compact on Refugees, let me just say, is a document being negotiated in a different context. It's not being negotiated so much at the UN, but it is being negotiated through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, normal member states' councils and meetings, and that also includes references to decent work. There is supposed to be a linkage between the two, and the way ILO sees that linkage, I mean, one important area is work, because refugees are also discriminated when they get into work. Many are not allowed to enter the labor market, and when they do, they're paid lower wages, have worse working conditions, or they're precarious, or they're working in the informal economy. So we adopted guidelines for this in 2016. These are principles for access of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons to the labor market. These now serve as a basis for a plan of action and a memorandum of understanding we adopted with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and we're working in a number of countries to help implement those. The Global Compact on Refugees will contain a comprehensive refugee response framework which encompasses the good practices of many different actors, agencies, member states, and so on, so that there are actual practical experiences projected in implementing the new compact on refugees, and we're providing ones on work. So let me come to the question of where do I see the global compacts really contributing to the existing migration governance framework? Well, first of all, it calls for cooperation and has specific measurable commitments that will be identified through continuing monitoring, thank you, monitoring and reporting. And this monitoring and reporting will be done to the UN General Assembly, but it will support things like ILO's Fair Recruitment Initiative. And let me just move on to one of the final questions I have, and that is, will it foster integration? And there, we know that integration, as the High Commissioner talked about, is extremely important as a factor for migrants and refugees, but it's not happening. The test of whether our work on the global compacts really will make a difference to migrants and refugees around the world in the 10 years to come will depend on whether we can get integration right. And that is whether it's temporary or long-term. But the fact is that we see them as others. And when we stop those processes that allow that to happen and really foster equality of treatment, we may then begin to realize the provisions of the Global Compact. And this is what came out of the conclusions of ILC's of the International Labor Conference General Discussion last year, how to put that voice and the standards back into implementation of the compacts. And I think we have to play it forward, and I'll just leave you with a few points that we see as needed. If we're going to make a difference in the lives of many with those two compacts, we have to shift the paradigm, and we have to shift it in these ways. So thank you very much for your time.
So now I invite Professor Philip Martin to go on so we continue with this global approach.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank Ibrahim. I want to thank his Lisbon colleagues. But most of all, I want to thank you who are still here after starting at 9 this morning. And we are still going at almost 7 this evening. And I understand there is an important football game coming up as well. So I will make sure that I will stop right on time. And let me just say at the outset an acknowledgement that state of California has 2 million dairy cows, and it's said that between the Portuguese and the Azorean immigrants, as well as the Dutch, that's most of the dairy farmers in the state of California. So the Portuguese are not just in Massachusetts, many of them didn't stay there, they came out west, and they play an important role in particular commodities. I'm going to take a slightly different take. Many of you I know are starting and doing empirical research, and Michele, who went to school at University of California, Davis, but was not an economist, not like me, took sort of a high-level approach. This is what the world's governments are trying to do, set a high standard, and we should set high standards. But I'm going to try to bring it down a little bit to the kinds of decisions that actually get made in governments, because I know that many of you are actually looking at the effect of a policy. It's really easy to announce a new policy, and it all sounds good, but then the question is, how do you actually work that out in practice? So what I'm going to do is go through very quickly in my 20 minutes and look at labor migration, and more specifically, temporary foreign worker programs, because one overriding goal of the negotiations, of the UN agencies generally, especially the development agencies, is to get the richer countries to open up more doors to workers from poorer countries. Okay, we have roughly 3.4 billion people in the world, workers in the world, I should say, 7.5 billion people, and 80%, a little over 80% of those workers are in developing countries. The average per capita income of the 30 rich countries is roughly $40,000 per person per year. In the 170 poor countries, it's $4,000 per person per year. That's despite the growth in China and everything else. That's a 10-to-1 income difference for just crossing, in some cases, a border. Question is, how do you manage that? And I want to start with what Michele emphasized. The best way to protect local workers from unfair migrant conditions is to protect migrant workers. If you protect migrant workers, you avoid a race to the bottom. So it's important to have equal. It's very hard to pull off equal. The important thing about temporary foreign worker migration is it's employer-led. Employers ask for workers if it's legal and regular, and governments have to react. Do you say yes or do you say no? What the Global Compact says is, well, you should recognize the reality that labor force growth is primarily in developing countries, but yet there's vacant jobs sometimes, or employers say they need workers in richer countries. Question is, how do you manage that? If you're in government and you get a request for 1,000 construction workers, should you say yes or should you say no? That's in the end the decision you have to make. The current system in most countries that accept temporary foreign workers is you've got to be offering a job and local workers have to have first preference. What the Global Compact negotiations are saying is, well, obviously if people are coming in and they're getting jobs, they must be needed or they wouldn't be coming in. So therefore, let's open up more pathways and make them regular and let them come as families, let them change employers. It would be a different model than we now have. And for those of you looking for topics, keep in mind that according to World Bank projections, who knows if they're right or not, there will be 800 million surplus workers in developing countries in 2050 if current projections go. And there could be, as we heard, there could be empty apartments in European cities with more deaths than births. How are you going to manage that movement? So the main takeaway is that in New York, what is being talked about is converting what I would consider from temporary workers to immigrants. That is, people could come with their families, they could change employers, they could eventually ask to stay. But what there is not being discussed, and what I will talk about in my few minutes, is exactly how do you decide whether to let people in, how many people to let in, and what conditions to put on them. And what I hope that you walk away with is some sense of how difficult it really is to develop programs that satisfy these rules, treat migrant workers equally, but at the same time operate systems that let local workers have first priority for jobs. Now, it's important to remember that most migrants are in the 30 rich countries. As Michele said, people aren't stupid. They generally move from poor to richer countries. Whenever you read about South-South migration being the biggest single flow, remember the definition. Singapore is a South country, according to the United Nations. The Gulf countries are all in the South. Taiwan's in the South. South Korea's in the South. So be very careful when you read South-South migration is the biggest corridor. It is, but only if you have a very peculiar definition of what's in the South. If you actually look at migration, 20% of the world's international migrants, as the UN defines it, are in one country, the United States. And that's followed by 3 countries that each have a little over 9 or 10%, and that's Saudi Arabia, Germany, and Russia. And then come the next 4, and that's the United Kingdom, United Arab Emirates, and France, and Canada. So migration is concentrated. It's not in, there are migrants from every country, in every country, but the biggest countries have about half of the world's migrants, and 2 of those, remember, are Gulf countries, and they are considered to be in the global South. You all seen the picture that shows remittances are rising rapidly, and remittances exceed official development assistance, and so one big argument is more migration means more remittances, means faster development. I already mentioned that there's about 3.5 million workers in the world and about 3.3 million employed workers. So not everybody has a job. And migrant workers, because they tend to be in the age group in which people work, the 18 to 65 or 15 to 65 age group, are a little over 4% of the world's workforce. They're a little over 3% of the world's population. And migrants tend to be concentrated. If you look at where they're concentrated globally, they're heavily overrepresented in agriculture, heavily overrepresented in services. They're also overrepresented in construction. So remember, this is Michele's ILO data. Most migrants are in the high-income countries. Because remember, the migrants in high-income countries are not just from developing countries. They're also from rich countries. A lot of people born in France work in the UK. A lot of people born in Canada work in the United States. There is migration within rich countries as well. And we often hear, and it is true, migrants are more likely to work often than locally born residents, but not always. There are countries like South Africa, Malaysia, where as more migrants come in, you actually can get falling labor force participation rates of local workers. So many things that are said about migration are true, but it's not automatic that bringing in migrants to take care of children allows local women to work. You often hear that. That's generally true, but not always true. There's a lot of circumstances in which that tends not to happen rather than it does. So now, a few words on the Global Commission. I think they're actually up to 23 recommendations now since they just added one on international cooperation. But I want to focus on 5 and 6, which are on labor migration, to try to point out the kinds of practical decisions that have to be made and for which many of the empirical studies that I heard in these days that I've been here would make, to my mind, could contribute a lot to helping deal with the practical policy issues that policymakers have to deal with. So GCM says, and not just GCM, but many things say, they say, start from the demographic and global realities of too many workers in some countries and vacant jobs in other countries, or jobs employers say they have trouble filling. Now, the question is, how do you respond? It's an employer-led process in the sense that people come because there are jobs. So I'm a farmer, I can't get workers, but migrants come and I want work. How does the government respond when I say, I don't have enough local workers to pick my apples? Let me hire people from another country to pick them. Well, I've got to then decide as a government official, how many workers do I allow to come in? And before I ask that question, I have to say, how hard did you try to find local workers? And it's not just putting an ad out, it's at what wage did you offer? At what working conditions? Did you offer housing? Did you offer benefits? These all get to be very complicated issues very, very quickly. What the GCM recommends is, regardless of the level of skill, a temporary worker should be able to come with his or her family members, and those family members should also get work permits. So it's that in many systems is more of an immigrant rather than a temporary worker. A temporary worker normally comes in to fill the job for a year or 2 years or less and then goes. The second major thing, and Michele mentioned this, is that workers should pay no fees. Now, believe it or not, it costs money to match workers and jobs. The main cost for the employer is not having the job filled. The main cost for the worker is not having a job. So the general rule is, if you invest in your human capital, if you get a credential, if you get a college degree, if you get a law degree, employers will normally pay to help you get a job. After all, at universities, we fly 3 candidates out at our expense to give seminars. We don't pay them a salary, we pay their travel cost. But if you don't have a skill, if you don't have a secondary school diploma, and you're looking for a labor job, there might be 10 workers for each job that's available. And so the tendency is for recruiters, these private for-profit entities, to charge workers as one way of allocating those scarce jobs. Now, ILO and many people say, that's terrible. You're making money off of these poor workers who are trying to improve their lot by working abroad. It is possible to repeal the laws of economics, but it's difficult. It is possible to say no worker paid fees, employers should pay all costs, but what the GCM goes on and says, but after you've paid my cost and I come into your country, I should be able to change employers. After all, you might be a bad employer. I might find a better one down the street. So my question as the employer is, how am I going to recoup those costs I paid to bring you in? I paid all your costs, but I'm not guaranteed that you're going to be there. There's a whole lot of practical questions when you start implementing some of these things. I used to work in the government, in the Labor Department, and these are exactly the kind of questions that we had to deal with. How exactly do you do this? It is good. It would be better for me as a migrant worker if you paid all my costs and once I arrived, I could change employers. That would help protect me. On the other hand, how would we get employers to do that? If we went down this road, we would be moving from essentially a temporary worker model to an immigrant model, because we would first have to decide which hurdles the employer has to jump over to get the workers, and then we would have to ask ourselves, does the migrant come in to fill a specific job? Or does the migrant come in to fill a job in construction, so you can change from one construction employer to another? Who's going to manage that? Are we going to let the migrant decide when and where to move? Are we going to have some kind of monitoring system so that we know exactly which employer that migrant is working for? What happens if I decide I don't like working for you, I quit, but then I can't find another job? How long can I stay? These are all the kind of questions that somebody has to answer if you're actually going to administer a temporary worker program. So these programs are hard to administer, and one of my big sort of appeals is for young people looking at this, think about the practical ways in which governments would take recommendations that come in international standards and actually put them into practice. The big thing we normally do governments normally do before allowing migrants to come in to work is to give a labor market test. Local workers get priority for jobs. But, and as Michele said, we want a whole of government analysis. We want everybody, every stakeholder involved. The problem is, having sat in meetings with stakeholders, they often disagree. They start out disagreeing, they end up disagreeing on whether migrants are needed or not. So how do you decide if the stakeholders don't agree? Do you say no, and then the employer says, I can't build that building because I don't have construction workers? Do you say yes, because otherwise it doesn't happen? That's a very hard thing to do. What often happens is we gloss over that. So Lance Pritchard's a guy at Harvard. He wrote a book, and he said, here's the labor market test. We'll have some procedure whereby employers honestly certify that they've looked and can't find workers. Well, give me a break. I mean, I can tell you a lot of employers will honestly certify something, and it may or may not be my definition of honesty. It could be theirs. And he never really grappled with this question of how do you decide whether to bring people in or not. Let me give you a concrete example. In the United States, we pick tomatoes green. So when you go to McDonald's and Wendy's, you're getting a tomato that was picked green, and then it's ripened with gas, and then it's sliced and they serve it. We use Mexican workers to pick those tomatoes. By 90% of the workers are Mexicans. Believe it or not, Mexico also produces tomatoes. They pick them when they're red. And some people prefer that. Turns out a lot of people prefer that. And Mexico is the world's largest tomato exporter. They export more tomatoes than any other country. Now, and partly because they have a better technology. So what should you do? Should you import the tomatoes or import the tomato pickers? I mean, that's a choice you're making in part through trade and in part through temporary worker migration policy. So there's not, as it were, a right and wrong answer as to what to do, but these things wind up being policy choices which then affect exactly how many workers under what conditions. I already mentioned the idea that employers pay all costs, but then workers are free to change jobs. That becomes a little controversial because of this idea. They say, well, maybe the worker has to stay with the employer until the employer recoups his or her costs. But then you get into the question, what if I'm a really bad employer? And I say, I spent $1,000 to recruit you, but I'm really bad. Do we say, well, you can get away from that bad employer, and we'll have a new appeals procedure for you to follow? Those processes get very complicated very quickly. I spent a summer writing about recruitment costs. It is very hard to regulate the recruiters of low-skilled workers. And the thing too, I happen to be in favor of immigration. Migration is a journey of hope and fear. It's hope for something better, it's fear of the unknown. For most migrants, most of the time, it's a successful experience. One abused worker is one too many. But it's important to keep in mind, for most workers in the Gulf countries, in most countries, they have a successful experience and they would go back if they could. I know we all want to have great bilateral programs. The United States does not have bilateral programs. But keep in mind what the competition is. These are Nepalis. They have passed the Korean language test. It is easier to get into Harvard than it is to be selected from Nepal to go to Korea. The competition is ferocious. There's 23 applicants for every job who's qualified and on the list. That's the kind of numbers that one has to think about when one's designing programs. We want to protect workers, but what's the main power of a Nepali worker when he comes up with a fee-charging recruiter? It's the power to say, no, I've got a better option. I don't have to pay you all this money. But if he doesn't have that option, then what do we do? How do we regulate that? The last two slides here. The hardest thing in the world is to choose between competing goods. I happen to be an economist, and let me give you a word of advice. If you have to choose between a bad and a good, choose the good. It takes no education. What takes education is if you have two goods and you have to decide which of those two goods gets the higher priority. That's the tough decision. The real decision is, how do you go between good things? How do you choose between good things? How does a country decide how many migrant workers to come in? After all, the U.S. could have lowered the barriers, and eventually did, to importing tomatoes, and raised the barriers to tomato pickers, and you would have gotten the outcome that has occurred much, much quicker. So there's a whole lot of policy variables that may not just be on migration. within the UN system, the development agencies generally are pro-migrant because they're looking at the remittances and the jobs. The rights agencies are much more rights-oriented. They want to make sure those migrant workers are protected. They're both good things, but dealing with the trade-offs between them is something that people find very difficult to do. And we have all these forums. Many of the forums come up with aspirations, but they don't grapple with the trade-offs. And I'm hoping that young researchers will help to do that because, to my mind, that's one of the most difficult challenges which is typically avoided on these things. So deal with the trade-offs, and I think, let me just go through these. It's getting to, the one thing, let me just say one thing. I've spent a lot of time in migrant camps, and this whole thing of developing aspirational ideals, aiming for the perfect, sometimes we miss the good. What's the single most powerful tool that an unskilled migrant worker has? It's a cell phone. Instead of all those meetings in New York with all the per diems, if you pre-program cell phones with helplines and some information, you would enormously improve protections. I work a lot with low-wage migrant workers. And in agriculture, for example, my biggest power is the ability to call my friend over somewhere else and say, what are they paying? What's the housing like? And move over that. I mean, just giving out cell phones to people as they arrive that work in the country that are pre-programmed with information would be a tremendous thing to help. The other thing is, I've been in a lot of camps where there are migrant workers, and you, I'm sure, have as well. Many workers don't have a secure locker to store their documents. Why do they give their documents to the employer? Because the employer says, I want them, but also because they don't have a place to store them securely. Requiring all the migrant housing centers to have secure lockers for their workers would do it a lot to improve protections. So, I mean, the main message here is, as you're looking at ways to make things better, yes, keep the high level, but think also of the little things that can also make a difference in the day-to-day lives of migrants. The trade-offs we already talked about. The big question from the Global Compact, remember, the United States, 20% of the world's migrants is not participating. And whatever comes out will probably be ignored, especially under this particular administration. In general, that list of countries that have most of the world's migrants, some of them are playing a big role, but many of them are not playing a prominent role. So we could wind up with a lot of negotiations of players that are important, but they're not as important in terms of the big flows of migrants. The final slide. When you think about labor migration, the hardest thing I found in dealing with policy people in this is that migration is always going to be a process that you manage. A lot of times when policymakers deal with migration issues, they say, here's a problem, let's pass a law, let's have a program, let's fix it. That never works. People are complex. They react to whatever law you pass. And so it's always going to be a process. It's going to be ever-changing. The trade-off thing, I've already said, people don't like to grapple with trade-offs. That's very important. It's very important to avoid extremes. We have no borders extremes. We have no migrants extremes. You almost never find a durable solution in the middle. And the final thing I leave you with is I spent many years chairing the Personnel Committee at the University of California, many years, 5 years. And our biggest issue was parking for the faculty. And at the end of one of the long faculty all want to park right next to their offices. At the end of the long session, we concluded anyone with a solution doesn't understand the problem. Anyone who understands the problem doesn't have a solution. I always think that parking problem is very much like managing the labor migration problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the three keynote speakers. I think after these presentations and the complexity of managing migration, including the cases where, like the case of the Portuguese, the government intends and wants to attract migrants to Portugal. So we still have 20 minutes, and I'm sure you have questions, comments. I propose to collect 3 questions and then give the floor to our invited speakers to reply. So the microphones, we have microphones. Okay. So is the first? Yes, please. Could you please introduce yourself and ask the question, okay?
Mali, I'm a PhD student of political science at the Goethe University in Frankfurt and the University of Saint-Joseph in Beirut. And I was writing a book chapter about the role of the Arab League in the global compact of refugees and migrants. And I was wondering, a big issue is bringing the Gulf countries to respect international law. How would you abort this question? I mean, I think it's one of the major problems is that they sign conventions but they don't implement them. How would you resolve this issue in the framework of the Global Compact on Migrants and Refugees?
Okay, is there any other question? I think it's better because maybe they are related. If not, okay, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Daniela Gregor. I work for the Immigration Department in Luxembourg, but I'm here in my personal capacity. Thank you very much for 3 great presentations. I very much like the emphasis on data, I think, and the myth dispelling. I think Professor Rosling would have been very happy with the session. So I have 2 questions. One about the Global Compact and the link to the SDGs. I was wondering about SDG 1 and the target on social protection systems. I was wondering whether that linkage is being made and how it could potentially impact migration flows in the medium-long term. And the second question is about the implication of municipalities in integration. I was wondering about the case of Portugal, whether there was any experience where municipalities maybe were not very happy about, integrating more migrants in their communities, and if that was the case, how that issue was dealt with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since we have 3 questions, I will give the floor. Who wants to start?
Well, I think most of the questions were for Michele and our High Commissioner, but implementation is, most laws are self-implementing, right? So the best protection for a worker at work is to make sure, for example, that he or she gets paid the minimum wage. Is if the employer doesn't pay the minimum wage, the employer won't get any workers. So the best protection for a worker is always the power to say, no, I've got a better deal. It is possible to protect workers when there's a surplus of workers, but it's very difficult. The example we usually use is the largest single user of electricity in the world is the California water system. Why? We push water uphill into Los Angeles. So can it be done? Can you push water uphill? Yes. It's incredibly expensive. Could you have enough inspectors so that the laws would be enforced even if there was a surplus of workers? Probably. I don't think I'll ever live to see that. But, we should do more to protect workers. But remember, the best protection is the power of the worker to say no to bad conditions.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'll take a slightly different stand as a lawyer and also at the ILO. And as a Californian, I think Los Angeles is doing pretty well by pushing water uphill. So they still one of the richest places to live. However, let me just address this extreme problem with the implementation of international human rights and labor rights conventions and so on. I mean, there is this backlash against adopting standards that seems to be taking root, unlike in the 1930s and 40s and 50s even, when standards were seen really as creating an even playing field and promoting the rule of law. We are coming back to that, I think, by seeing the lawlessness that's going on around the world and the fragmentation. The only thing that really brings us together are the values and standards that we share. And so we have to create that fabric in an even tighter knit. And that is very challenging. I think everyone playing a role makes a difference. And if you just look at what happened in the United States with children in detention and children being separated from their families, it takes everyone to recognize that this not only violates international standards, national standards, but goes against our values to see the impact that that can have to change that course. So even bad directions, even difficult directions can be changed. And I think human rights and labor rights encompasses values that we have shared and do share and have since over 100 years. I mean, 100 years next year is our anniversary. The ILO turns 100. We're the oldest agency in the UN system. Those values matter. Recently, to give an example, Qatar, a complaint was brought against Qatar by the trade unions because migrant workers were not treated according to international labor standards. Now you can say, well, Qatar's not enforcing its standards. That's what they said. What happened was a negotiation, which is a win-win situation that Qatar has now opened an office. The International Labor Organization has an office there. They are allowing a whole program of work to go forward, which aligns with international labor standards. And there's a monitoring process in place that watches every bit of that, but works in partnership with governments like Qatar all over the world. And working in partnership and monitoring and holding to those standards really has to be where we start. But it is the people on the ground. It is the workers, it's the employers, the trade unions, the migration organizations, researchers like yourself that document what is really happening, and that is where it's really important. Documenting and putting out the evidence and the data. That's how we get back to our values and see these standards as really embodying our values. They're not alien documents. They are what we believe should be the baseline. And the last question, I think, is the link to the SDGs. One is terribly important. I didn't have time to show you all the SDGs that relate to migrant workers. We just didn't have the time. But one, of course, we have a social protection division. We're working very closely with the social protection division and our social protection floors. And it cuts both ways. Promoting social protection is one of the slides that I showed you. You will create more incentives for workers to stay home, to invest. Not having social protection is one more reason that drives people abroad. If social protection systems exist and they're robust and strong, it may also entice workers to return home to systems where hopefully that also means that more jobs are being created. But social protection is extremely important, and we are promoting the social protection floors for migrant workers as well, as a part of this equality of treatment.
Thank you. Regarding the question about municipalities that might not be so eager to support migrants' integration, I think it's something we don't have in Portugal, really. I don't remember having a mayor saying that it is not supportive of this type of actions. We had local elections last year, and we had just small approaches to populism in some suburban areas of Lisbon. And even those, they could not get support. We had one particular candidate who tried to have this speech, and he could not get elected. So I think it's something of consensus. I think it also comes from a need that mayors recognize, which is the shortage of workers on one hand, and sometimes of students. For instance, Bragança, they have a small university institute in Bragança. Now they have 25% of international students, of foreign students, and they are eager to get more because it's the only way for a city like Bragança to renew, to create some local economy, And I think this is, I think it's quite consensual. I get many contacts by mayors who want to develop local strategies because they, for instance, just last week, they want to build a factory and they don't have 500 people to work in that municipality. So they know for sure that if it's not migrants who come in and support the development of these local small cities in sometimes more rural areas of the country, then it's not the Portuguese, because we are still, as I said, we are still losing every year, now not hundreds, but at least 10,000 of people leaving the country, young people leaving the country to other countries. So I think there is this openness in mayors. Sometimes I get angry mayors because they pledged for the number of refugees that they didn't get. I get that. They had more capacity to receive people, and you know the aim of relocating 160,000 refugees from Greece and Italy, it only allowed 28,000 to come. So sometimes they overpledged, they didn't get the people they wanted, and they scream at me, and that's fair. Even though it's not my fault, as you might know.
Okay. Is there any other question, comment? Yes, please.
Dr. Martin, Dr. Martin, you raise a lot of very interesting questions, and you give some practical advice, but I'm wondering, how do you figure out the nuances of each policy when you don't have the data to answer those questions? So to give you a concrete example, in Lithuania, they recently launched a seasonal migration program, which is similar, right? It's very temporary in nature, up to 6 months. But it's a program that was launched in March, and we still don't know, we don't have any data to figure out the impacts that will have on the local labor force. So at that point, isn't it better to take into account the international labor standards in terms of trying to figure out the policy priorities and wait to see what kind of data emerges for us to better the policy? Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, I think the most important international labor standard is the equal treatment of migrant and local workers. The difficulty, Michele alluded to it, is what happens when you have a migrant-dominated sector and that sector gets isolated over time from what's happening in the rest of the economy? What happens when you have 60, 70% of the workers in a particular sector or area that are migrants, and the rest of the society might be adding new benefits to workers that are costly, but that particular sector doesn't have to because it relies on workers who are coming in temporarily and going out? Those are the very difficult kinds of questions to sort of answer, because dealing with those often involves trade policy, sometimes involves technology policy. It's not just labor policy. As the tomato example in the United States shows, if we had made it without the free trade agreement with Mexico, we would still probably be producing a lot more of those green tomatoes and importing fewer. But we had a free trade agreement. The indirect effect was to reduce the demand for labor in that particular commodity and increase the imports. So it's hard to make general rules, and yet the global system tends to deal with general rules because they play out differently in each area. But it seems to me the one fundamental ILO standard that should prevail is the equal treatment, because if you don't do that, you'll get a race to the bottom. We'll get even faster concentration in those particular sectors.
Thank you very much. We came to the end of this plenary session. I think we have here a lot of things to reflect on. Our invited speakers made very interesting presentations and put very complex questions. So for us as researchers and having here in the audience so many PhD students, I hope you get the inspiration to go on, because there are many, many research questions. And I think that's really very, very important to keep in mind that the role of values, the fundamental values, all of us, each of us has a responsibility to be aware and participate in the solution, because in fact it's very difficult to implement this kind of decisions, but we must try and to do our own job, contributing for this, providing information, fighting against the fears that are creating this movement and against migrants, and are explaining the growth of extreme right parties all over the world and so on. So I think that all of us have got the inspiration to continue these reflections, and let's applaud our invited speakers. Thank you very much.